Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of 1+1, your place for inconvenient truth-telling and myth-busting. And I'm so honored and really excited to have back on the program, we have Mix, Fiona Sim. Fiona Sim is a graduate of anthropology and media studies at the University of London, where she was also trying to run for a student council on a superb anti-racist, anti-imperialist, and anti-heteronormative and great left-wing platform overall. This is another episode where the theme and topics related to China will be discussed. And like my past interview with my friend Jay Watts, the central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada, this is an all things China edition where we'll be exploring the history, current affairs, and the system of China through an anti-imperialist lens, a post-colonial Marxist lens, and even if possible, hoping to have a good critical discussion on some of the flaws of China. So Fiona, welcome back to the program, first of all.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back. Yeah, really always love watching all of your interviews. I always seem to get something really interesting and different out of people that I hadn't known before.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you back. And of course, the last time you were on the program, we had a very good, debate with the late Omar Latif, rest in peace, Omar, rest in power, of the the trade unionist activist and member of the Communist Party of Canada. And of course, we were debating Morgana Adby about whether there's a genocide going on in Zhejiang and stuff like that. And I think it was a pretty good debate. It's actually one of the most popular episodes we have, and the reason why I want to have you back so much is because many people in the audience and people who I know who watch the program in person were saying to me, "Hey, that was a very good debate, but next time you need to give more time to Fiona. Like we wanted to hear from Fiona. We hardly got to hear from Fiona." So I said to all the people, "Don't worry, guys. I will make sure to have they back, on the program." So anywho, thank you for coming back on the show. All right, so let's get into it because I have so many questions. I want to ask you about China. So let's try to get to as much of them as as possible. And my first question I wanted to ask you regarding your home country, which I completely forgot to ask this when Jay was on the show, and that is, can you explain how the education system works in China, and how is education from early childhood to elementary, middle, and high school? How are the universities funded? What are the costs of all of this? And is it very expensive, like the US, Canada, Australia, and England? Or explain.
So obviously I didn't, as part of the diaspora, I'm a BBC British-born Chinese. I didn't grow up in China, but thankfully I've, especially over the past few years, I've befriended quite a few people who have grown up on the mainland and reap the benefits of the education system. So obviously in China, like with most parts of the world, education is free from the ages of, I think it's about 3 or 4 years old, right through to the ages of 18. And at 18, that's sort of like same as in the West, same as in Britain, really. That's the point where students will go on to university or to college. And in terms of tuition fees, it is significantly less than in the West. So just for context, in Britain, an average student pays about £9,000 a year in tuition. They can
out of their own pockets. And
yeah, exactly. They can take out a loan, which they have to pay back with horrendous interest fees. You can also get a maintenance loan here, but again, you have to pay that back with horrendous sort of interest rates that you have to pay off. I think they give you something between 25 and 30 years to pay it off, and it comes out of your salary every month. And naturally in China, that's just not really a thing, because tuition can range from sort of like, depending on your background and your status, there are subsidies available for poorer families, for lower income families. And this can mean that tuition can range from anything from a few hundred a year to, for the more sort of like quote unquote elite universities, it can also range to a few thousand a year. But again, this is all dependent on your local provincial government subsidies, which will be put on, which it depends on your province, depends on your region. But in general, it's significantly cheaper. And the real sort of barrier, I think, for students in China, as opposed to the monetary costs, which for anyone anyway is an expensive thing, because you have to move away from home, you are getting used to a whole new city most of the time, you have to rent out your own dorm room, things like that. It is quite expensive. However, one of the main barriers is the academic side of things. So there are very important key exams that students will take at the end of the year, and these exams are sort of like nationwide. Everyone takes them at the same time. And during these periods, I know across China, I think it happens in Hong Kong, in both North and South Korea. It's a very special period, I think, during the year, where all the roads will sort of like, especially around exam time, most of the roads in surrounding areas nearby these key schools, they'll be completely closed. They'll have police escorts to help take students to college or to school for their exams if they face any trouble getting there. It's a very sort of like formalized, important, significant part of the student life.
Wow.
Determine everything. So anything that the state can do to get a student to sit and take the exam, they will do that. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, what a lot of provinces did do was students who were isolating or quarantining or couldn't physically make it to their exams, they would send in sort of like invigilators or examiners or whoever to provide a space, to make a space near their home or inside their home where they could take their exams sort of like in peace and quiet, and they'd ensure that there's no disruptions, there's no sort of like external factors that could contribute to a student's detriment, essentially. And I just find the examination system very fascinating in China, because from what I know of the past, sort of especially the past decade or so, there has been a heavy emphasis on ensuring that tests are standardized to ensure that students from ethnic minority backgrounds aren't disadvantaged. So everyone sort of like starts off at a baseline, but students sort of from ethnic minority backgrounds, and this is to some slight controversy still across China about whether it should be put in place, but effectively there is affirmative action. So if you are from a minority ethnic background, one of the 56 recognized ethnic groups in China, you will actually get sort of like a certain number of points, which will be sort of automatically allocated to you or added onto your examination score. And it's seen as a way, not as like significantly disadvantaged like Han Chinese students, but sort of raising them up to the same level, so there's an equal playing field, because the government is very much aware that people from ethnic minority backgrounds tend to be from lower income families, from rural or isolated provinces, who for whatever reason may not have the same sort of like access to the same quality of education as Han students, whose families, parents may have already benefited from the education system. But over the past 10, 20 years ago, with China's poverty alleviation schemes, education has very much improved. But of course, there is still a significant proportion of the population who did not achieve sort of like high school diplomas or the equivalent of high school diplomas, who did not manage to complete their education because of poverty, because they didn't have equal access, or even because of things like gender inequality and women being expected to stay at home or not being able to afford to be sent to school by their parents. So that's a very sort of significant part of the examination factor. And there's debate online across China whether or not this is like a fair system, but ultimately it's one that is no one can sort of contest it. It's standardized across the board, and it is sort of like a state what's it called, a state mandated sort of policy for schools and universities to do so.
This is exactly why I want to have you on this program, because we don't hear news like this in China. We're always getting nothing but negative news about China. So that's wow. I find that very fascinating. And actually, just before I get to my second question, actually talk to us a bit about your background. You don't have to tell us, like who, like your current employer is, or anything like that. But you mentioned that no, Youri, I actually didn't grow up in China. I grew up, I'm part of the Chinese diaspora. So talk to us a little bit about your background then.
So yeah, my background is it's a little bit messy because colonialism. But my family is originally from Singapore, really. But I have ancestors. lots of my other extended family, and sort of like grandparents, things like that, they're from mainland China, from Malaysia, from Singapore, from all across there. But due to colonialism, there was a lot of migration, a lot of movement. And interestingly, my grandfather actually did leave China, I think around the time of the Cultural Revolution. I think it might have been just before it started, but it was in a period where the People's Republic of China had been established, but it hadn't. Well, no, the People's Republic of China hadn't been formally established, but the Republic of China had been. And it was a very interesting period because it was during this transition from feudalism into an experimental form of China, the pre sort of like Mao era, when Mao was sort of like coming to power and when Mao was gaining a lot of traction among the masses. And at that time, China was incredibly impoverished. The average life expectancy, I think, was about 34 years old for men. So it was not an easy time. So my grandfather was one of many in his family who were essentially forced to migrate in order to sort of like to be able to provide for their family. And that's how sort of like he ended up in Singapore. And yeah, it's and I guess it's a tale of not just colonialism in the sense of British colonialism, which we obviously know of, but Japanese imperialism has had a significant impact on my family background as well, because I'm sure for a lot of your viewers or people who may not be well versed in Southeast Asian history, Japan sort of occupied, colonized a significant part of Southeast and East Asia, including sort of like Singapore, parts of China, Korea, loads of the islands across the area. And my grandfather actually very narrowly escaped a Japanese killing field by the grace of a neighbor who had warned him that, you know, don't get on this truck, because soldiers have come around and they started knocking on people's doors looking for all the working age men. And they were saying, look, come with us, we'll give you some jobs. We know like this area is really poor, we'll give you opportunities, like Japan wants to give you opportunities. So they would round up all the young working men in the village in the different provinces or blocks, and say they're going to take them somewhere to give them new jobs. But of course they weren't taking them to any jobs. They were taking them to be executed or to labor camps where most of them would never hear from their families again. So I'm very fortunate that my grandfather managed to avoid that fate. And yeah, so sort of my family history is one that's very embedded in Japanese imperialism, as well as one side of my family is very anti-communist, as the other is a lot more sort of sympathetic towards it. I think that's probably the right word, just because, you know, there is an appreciation of what China used to be like and how quote unquote backwards China used to be, in the words of my own sort of aunties and uncles. But under Mao, they experienced significant sort of just improvements to the quality of life, to the point where some of them have returned to China. Some of them now sort of like are very happily sort of in the southern part of China. However, for the other part of my family, their grievances with communism, quite interestingly, is because they had certain parts of land taken away from them. Or I think there was one case where my paternal great-grandmother or something like that, I don't know, they had land seized from them and redistributed to the working class, well, the peasants at the time, the peasantry at the time. And obviously this doesn't go down well if you're a rich landowner who profits off the exploitation of others.
Yeah.
And for my mum's side of the family, whenever my mum recounts the story, she's always like, well, they sort of deserve to have it taken from them. Like, they didn't need any of it. Everyone else was poor. Why did they deserve to be rich when everyone else was poor? So even from my side of the family, which isn't necessarily communist or pro-communist, they also acknowledge the benefits of communism and the redistribution and seizing of land from like bourgeois landowners. So it's been very sort of interesting trying to reconcile both parts of the family and the very deep ingrained anti-communism that runs through one side of it in comparison to the other, which is very much peasantry.
So, sounds like a perfect match made in heaven then, actually. Actually, funny enough, I actually have like a playlist, that I created. It was originally supposed to just be like 1+1 episodes when the topic of like China, the Koreas, and other parts of of the Chinese diaspora, would come about. But it ended up just being like just like a huge playlist filled with very interesting like online events which were all about China and stuff like that. And I actually included in there a really interesting documentary about the persecution of the Singaporean left, the Singaporean people from Singapore who are communists who had to flee to Britain. And one of them is actually a very interesting doctor who's involved with like Palestinian solidarity. So gonna have to definitely, gonna have to make you a regular, and we're gonna have to have you back on the program to talk about Singapore then. All right.
Also, you speak of, is it I've forgotten her name. Is her name Anne?
Could very well be.
Because I think I might know exactly who you're talking about.
I'll definitely double check afterwards and let you know. But I think it definitely probably is. Definitely probably is her. All right, but on to you opened up a lot of things that that I definitely want, that we're definitely going to revisit throughout the conversation. And so my second question then I have to ask you then is, what kind of a socio-economic system was in place in, I guess you would call it, ancient China before the Century of Humiliation?
So before the Century of Humiliation, to be honest, like with a large proportion of the world, feudalism was the main sort of like the main way of life. And under feudalism, there's always debates about, oh, is feudalism better than capitalism and vice versa? But the reality of it was feudalism was essentially a form of enslavement of any of the peasantry, of the working classes, of anyone who wasn't born into aristocracy, which meant that you weren't just owned, you weren't just quote unquote owned by your employer, but your entire family, your possessions, your worth, everything to do with your life would essentially be owned by it could have been a monastery, it could be sort of like the landowner, the king, the emperor, whoever's land that you lived on. That was nothing. You owned nothing to yourself. You were essentially a serf. You essentially lived for the owner of the land, owner of the property. Everything you did had to go back to them. So it wasn't even just sort of like, oh, you pay taxes to your local governments or your local state or council. It was no, everything you earned went directly back to the king, the emperor, the owner, the aristocrat of the land. So for a significant amount of peasantry, this did mean that there was no access to healthcare, there was no access to education, and education was very much something that was not frowned upon per se. But education wasn't just a privilege, but it was seen as a means of emancipation for the poorer classes. So it was heavily sort of discouraged. And if you were seen to be educated, this was a problem, especially if you weren't born into the right noble families or the right classes. So China has had a very deeply embedded history of a very unfair, unequal sort of class system, which did not recognize the rights of anybody who didn't own property or didn't have some sort of significant worth, value, or ancestry to their name. So if you were born towards a certain lineage, it was very likely that you would remain within that lineage and your descendants would be as well. So social mobility wasn't really, it just wasn't really a thing. Like, there's much to say about, there were obviously very rich cultures, there was a very rich history of different dynasties and eras, spanning throughout ancient China, and some amazing philosophers. We all know Confucius, for example, but there's a significant history of amazing poets, philosophers, sort of like theorists, legal theorists, who have formed, mathematicians even, who have formed the backbone of much of sort of like what Western civilization is based upon today. Like, contrary to popular belief, Greek or ancient Greece wasn't the quote unquote cornerstone of democracy. Like there were these debates and discourses across ancient China, as there were across sort of like across ancient India, across Benin, across Africa, Latin America. Like it's not, there's always this myth that, you know, only Western civilization was the formation of
Yeah,
all
exactly.
things, sort of like, you know, all things that we know today come from the Greeks, but it's simply not true. And obviously, in spite of the horrendous sort of living conditions that the majority of the population had to live by, the diseases that would, you know, kill children in their infancy, there was a lot of art and culture and significant, what's it called, not inventions, findings, discoveries that were made across ancient Chinese societies, and a lot of this was done cross-culturally as well. So you would have probably heard of ranges of explorers such as Zhong He, who was a eunuch, and he was ordered by the emperor at the time to sort of like on an expedition, exploratory mission across the world. So his first sort of like one of his first ports of call, one of his most significant, was to the Horn of Africa, to East Africa, where he and sort of like his ships, his sailors, they took part in a trade exchange where they would give gifts of sort of like gold and wheats and things, potteries that you could only find in ancient China, in exchange for things like some of the animals that they had on the coast there. So things like giraffes and elephants, they would then bring back to the king, to the emperor. So there's always been a history of sort of like of trade across ancient China with the rest of the Eastern world, whether it was in Persia or India at the time, or across sort of like what we now know as like the West Asia and North Africa. So I think there's a lot to be taken from ancient Chinese history, and most of it I personally wouldn't say is good, but the nature of a multipolar world, the nature of trade along the quote unquote Silk Road, there's a rich history of that, and for a certain time it worked. There was no colonialism in the sense that we understand now involved. And sure, yes, we understand there was, you know, imperial China was split up into so many different factions, and you know, there was a lot of inter-ethnic conflict and things like that. But ultimately, in terms of its relations with other countries, the notion that China has always been this sort of like overarching dominating force that is trying to eat up the rest of the world just simply isn't true, because these trade routes, these trade networks have existed for, you know, a millennia, if not more, outside of the West when they were going through their so-called dark ages. The rest of the world was thriving.
That's fascinating that you say that, and that's a perfect segue then to this question, which is, can you explain what the Century of Humiliation was? And of course, one can't talk about that period without explaining British imperialism in China. So with that, you also have with that, please also do explain what the Opium Wars were as well.
Oh gosh, yeah. So the Century of Humiliation, there's always this underplaying I notice in sort of like Western coverage of British colonial history in China, that underplays it as like, oh, you know, China is just making a big deal out of nothing. They weren't actually colonized. Like, you know, Britain actually colonized some places, but
yeah,
China wasn't one of them. And this is sort of like, I think, where a lot of the education system in Britain, it isn't just ignorant, or it isn't just sort of like exclusive. It is purposely formulated and created in a way to disseminate sort of propaganda that colonialism wasn't that bad actually, and the extent and reaches of colonialism never really get explored. So the Opium Wars, I'm not gonna lie, I'd never heard anything about the Opium Wars up until secondary school, and even then it was a reference in a book we were reading about some white British woman. I think, what was it called? It's a book by Philip Pullman, Ruby in the Smoke. And in this book, she goes to visit opium dens, and there's like this brief mention of the dirty Chinese sort of like sneaking in and overwhelming the British population with opium and things like that. And it was
wow,
it's an interesting introduction, because at that point, I think it was, you know, at that point where you start to see your own history as documented in fiction and non-fiction, that you realize, hang on a second, this is a very one-sided sort of history. There's a lot of context missing. And what people don't seem to realize with the Opium Wars, it wasn't just that China said no to opium, that China said no to opium because they were being mean and they didn't want to accept British trade. It was that Britain was purposely using China via India in order to flood its markets with opium, because China refused to, or the emperor at the time, refused to essentially bow down to British rule and accept terms and conditions, which would mean that certain parts of China would be essentially given up as collateral to the British, because as they flooded China with opium, this meant that the markets got oversaturated, which means the value of China's other commodities at the time essentially went down. And whilst this was happening, the British essentially made certain parts of China so dependent on opium that rough estimates at the time put it as something anywhere between 60 and 80% of the populations of southern China in Guangdong, Guangxi, Nanjing were addicted to opium in some way or form. So this wasn't just adults, this was children, this was elderly, this was grandparents. Opium became sort of like the only reason for some people to live. So yes, opium dens, opiates were a massive problem, and a lot of it was getting imported back into Britain. But what's missing from the history is sort of like why it's why it happened. And it's that, Britain wanted to essentially open a drug trafficking network through China in order to get to India, because at the time as well, Britain was expanding its many colonial tentacles across the continent of Asia, in particular in Africa and Latin America as well. So opium was very important for them. And when they didn't get what they want, when China essentially said, no, okay, we're gonna put a stop to this whole opium thing now. You're actually flooding our market and destroying our own forms of trade, because opium is suddenly the only thing that everyone wants, because you're making them dependent and addicted to it. And they decided to close their borders and refuse to accept any more opium. And the British, like the British has always done, ignored that. They instead decided, okay, well, we're going to war. If you won't accept our trade, then you leave us no choice. So they gave China essentially the ultimatum that you either accept our opium and accept our trades, aka drug trafficking, or we'll take whatever we can get out of China, and there's nothing you can do about it. And so there were two opium wars. The first opium war is probably the most sort of like significant one, because of the just sort of like the number of casualties it produced, especially on the British side. There's always, again, an underestimation of the Chinese people. When they want to raise an army, they will raise an army. They won't go down without a fight. And the British, to many extents, weren't expecting this, and this led to a lot of British casualties. So the first Opium War essentially was not a trial run, but it was a failure in the essence of, in the eyes of the British Empire at the time. And this is when the majority of the yellow peril propaganda came out, because it was seen that they were losing the war, therefore they needed to amp up the propaganda on the home front. So suddenly newspapers, prints, sort of like local communities that were hosts to a lot of Chinese people were suddenly deemed as sort of like, these are dangerous people, these are criminal masterminds, that they are trying to drug all us up with opium. They are the ones who are trying to invade us. If we don't protect our people, if we don't go and send troops out to China to stop them, then they're going to come and invade us. They're going to take over your wives, your children. They're going to come and
when it was literally the other way around.
Absolutely,
it was British colonialists that were doing that.
Yeah, so there's this whole campaign. I mean, I think in the Limehouse regions of London, Chinatown regions, in Liverpool, so in all places where there was now significant sort of populations of Chinese communities, they would then be essentially ghettoized and persecuted. So what we see is Chinatowns now, essentially, a lot of them were formed because Chinese communities were essentially driven and forced into these locations so that the British officials could keep a closer eye and a closer watch on them. Because the British people at the time demanded it, because if you you leave the Chinese unchecked, then who knows what they're going to do to your families. So let's keep them in one corner, let them do their business, let them have their opium and whatever it is horrible things they're doing, and we'll keep them there, and then they're not going to come to any harm. So Chinatowns weren't really a form of celebration or a form of, cultural coming together. They were very much a way of the British to control sort of like China, the Chinese diaspora, because a lot of these communities would send money back home. And so again, here comes all the accusations of Chinese spies, of the emperor sending spies into Britain to undermine the British Empire, to undermine the British government. And around this time, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act over in the US coming into play. This was about post the Second Opium War, I believe, where it was, again, for a very similar reason, not just opium, but for the fact that China was finally, maybe not finally, but China was being seen as a threat because of how it had performed and responded to the Opium Wars. So obviously within the Opium Wars, Hong Kong eventually did, Hong Kong was ceded to the British eventually because China lost. China lost its part of the war, and as collateral, Britain very, very kindly said, look, we're gonna take Hong Kong. If you don't give us Hong Kong, we'll take somewhere else. So if you give us Hong Kong, sign this treaty, it'll be fine. We'll consider your debts to have been paid. Your debts, but not accepting our opium. It's all good, it's all fine. So they took Hong Kong, became the colonial administrators, and that's sort of where, that's all part and parcel of the Century of Humiliation, which was degrading China, splitting China up into smaller and smaller chunks, to the point where, places like Macau, which was formerly administered by the Portuguese colonizers, that again was another area of great loss and humiliation, because the British worked with the Portuguese in order to acquire sort of like that landmass. Same thing again with parts of Shanghai and Beijing. So during those times, there were actual sort of gated, not
actually, Mixim, give me one moment. I'm just going to turn off this noisy fan of mine. Okay, sorry about that. Oh, and the sun. By the way, the sun in your window is kind of like shining a bit on you. So I think you need, like...
Let me hang on. Let me.
Sure, no problem.
Hopefully that's a bit better. Close one curtain now.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay.
The sun is starting to set.
All right, okay. So you're saying that the Century of Humiliation. So basically, the Opium Wars is part of that Century of Humiliation, and the loss of Hong Kong to the British and Macau to the Portuguese. That's part of the Century of humiliation.
Yeah, absolutely. So and with portions of, it wasn't just sort of like the quote unquote the now autonomous regions of Macau and Hong Kong, but regions of Shanghai, of Beijing were essentially completely locked off to actual Chinese people. So they were administrated informally by the British and taken over. Like you all have heard of, I can't remember the name of the palace, my brain isn't working, but the British came, and these parts of, they seized key parts of Shanghai and Beijing in an attempt to essentially force the emperor to cede control. So they would burn down sort of like palaces, they would burn down sort of like key historical landmarks, artifacts, key governmental places, as a means to be like, if you don't cede to us in the ways that we want, we will continue and take more and more China until you no longer have any control. And again, it was to the point where there were certain areas where it was exclusively white. So you will see when you go to Shanghai, there are certain portions of Shanghai that look very much like Britain, who have a lot of very British architecture that doesn't quite seem to fit in with all the rest. And that's one of the reasons why, because the British, they really tried to make it their own.
Unbelievable. Wow, that's shocking, and that's a perfect segue to the Boxer Rebellion. Please talk to us about the Boxer Rebellion, which wasn't China's first effort to resist external forces trying to conquer and dominate China. But if we're talking about the 20th century, this was China's first effort to resist imperialism from the West, correct?
Yes, yes. The Boxer Rebellion. I think hopefully more even in the West, you would have heard of the Boxer Rebellion in some capacity. I believe when I was sort of like growing up, the Boxer Rebellion was always sort of like, oh, you know, the savages were just doing their thing. Like, you know, the British tried to stop them, but they yeah, the narrative that we had growing up was that there were a bunch of savages who didn't know what they wanted, and they were trying to kill their own people and sort of like, you know, take over. So the British came in and tried to save them, but it didn't work. So the savages ruled again. So again, the narratives around the Boxer Rebellion
Wow.
tend to be very heavily propagandized. The British especially don't like to admit, they don't like to admit defeat. They don't like to admit that things didn't go exactly as planned, and that there are Chinese actors who are in every sense autonomous and able to make decisions for themselves, who are able to resist colonialism, who do not need any sort of savior, that, you know, they are fully capable, literate, and able to know that, you know, China deserves to be able to self-determine, that China deserves to be able to have its own history written for and by its own citizens rather than by British colonial administrators. So it's another, I think something with Chinese history is that at every point that you learn about, you'll learn it in a way that's very much sanitized and underplays the role of the Chinese masses, the Chinese peasantry in particular, in sort of like rising up against colonialism and the extent of the brutalities that they did face by colonial administrators, where, as I mentioned before, there were certain parts of the land they couldn't have access to. You know, there was mass discrimination in jobs, like in, you know, colonial Hong Kong. There's a nostalgia amongst the youth of today who didn't experience colonialism, because by the time they were born, the Britain's formal sort of like administration of Hong Kong had ended.
Yeah.
Who see these colonial periods as sort of as periods to romanticize, as periods where their parents flourished, that was significantly better than life today. But the reality is how the Boxer Rebellion sort of like came about. It wasn't just because of some petty reasons, like, you know, the British wouldn't let me, I don't know, the British were mean to me one day, so we decided to hate all of them and kill them. So yeah, it's a very sort of interesting history. I'm just trying to remember sort of like the key elements to pluck out. So if you just give me like a couple of
Sure, no problem.
The chronology in my head. Just trying to think.
But it's safe to say that the Boxer Rebellion was a sort of broad rebellion where the peasantry joined forces with people who would have been brutal feudal subjects to them.
Yes, absolutely. Essentially it was sort of like, so it was sorry, I didn't even mention, so it took place, I think, between 1899 to the early 1900s. So this would have been sort of just post-Opium Wars, just post the Chinese Exclusion Act that had been implemented in America. It was a time where obviously the world's sort of like Axis powers and things were sort of establishing dominance. And so Beijing was sort of like Beijing became the center of international attention, not just by the British, but by the Americans, because they started to realize Beijing actually has a lot of power concentrated in it. And if you can get Beijing, you can get the whole of China. So China encompassing at the time Xinjiang, Tibet, which have always been a part of China's history. Not always, but for a significant amount of centuries, had always been part of China's protectorate. And previous emperors had made sort of agreements that they would provide protection for these areas in exchange for these areas becoming sort of like part of China or trading with China, things like that. So, but through Beijing, was where all of these sorts of like decisions were held. And essentially many of the sort of like alliances that were formed, so you had the British Empire encompassing Australia, New Zealand,
Canada.
Canada, at the time sort of occupied India. You've got France, of course you had Japan who had sort of like had its sights set on China for a very long time, who was already colonizing Korea at the time. You had Germany, you had I think Italy and the Netherlands, Belgium. Essentially all of the Western world had come together and agreed that, you know, they would form these 8 nations that would tackle the growing problem that is China. So in essence, in the same ways that we have like NATO today and how they're going after Russia, at that time China was sort of like seen as not more of a threat than Russia, but it was seen as a hub of how do you say a challenge to global hegemony, in a way that Russia wasn't quite at the time, because it was building up to the October Revolution, and obviously the priorities changed when World War I came along. So there was a majority of people involved in the Boxer Rebellion. You had the peasantry, you had a large amount of peasantry who had been involved and trained in martial arts, who basically had been sort of radicalized at that point into realizing that, hang on a second, why are all these international forces suddenly so interested in China? Why are these international forces sort of, you know, coming into our country and burning down our palaces, burning down our historical artifacts, burning down towns and villages, keeping entire sort of like areas hostage essentially for their own gain? And so all these groups would be coming together in a form of anti-colonial resistance to essentially kick these forces out. There's no sort of like way of mincing words, but it really was sort of like China, who was not quite sort of united in the way it is now, coming together for perhaps one of the first times in history across the entire sort of like not continent, the entire mainland, and deciding that they would take history into their own hands. And you know, there was a lot of bloody battles, there was a lot of death on both sides, and a lot of Chinese peasantry did die as a result, like masses at the hands of, you know, British and American bullets in particular. However, on the other side, there's always this notion, I think, even with when you hear about the Vietnam War, you think it's a bunch of rice farmers who rose up against the American army, and it's treated as sort of like a bit of a joke, like ha ha ha, look at how the US army were defeated by farmers. But in reality, the Viet Cong, yes, they were rice farmers, but they were also trained guerrilla warriors, they were trained guerrilla fighters, and they knew exactly what they were doing. In the same way with the Boxer Rebellion, yeah, sure, a lot of these people were illiterate, a lot of these people were peasants or farmers, but a lot of them were strategically very, very clever. They knew exactly who to target. They knew exactly how to surround certain battalions, how to use the knowledge they had of their country, of their cities, in order to resist against the British. So this meant that there were various factions across sort of Beijing in particular, across China, that were sort of like resisting against these foreign forces. But history, I mean, particularly in English history, you don't tend to hear that it wasn't just like one sort of like formation that just got defeated or whatever, but in actuality it was on the fight was being fought on sort of like several fronts across China. Some were a lot weaker than others, and again, Tibet at the time, I believe there was significant riots and protests there, as there was some resistance again to the feudal state of the Dalai Lama at the time, and the British administrators were coming as well, and there was a whole kerfuffle there, but that again never gets left out of the history, partially because, you know, the British want to retain this element that Tibets were, you know, they were completely divorced from China, that they're never part of China, therefore Chinese events never affected Tibet. But also again because the British suffered significantly in terms of they had to retreat a large amount of soldiers because of the Tibetan resistance at the time. So all across China, it was just sort of like a mass uprising that the emperor even supported. And there was a lot of controversial figures involving sort of like, I think there was this preacher in Hong Kong who was very much like I don't know if castrate is the word, but he believed he was the brother of Jesus Christ. And so he tried to propagandize people to fight against the Chinese and fight for the Eight Nation Alliance. It was very sort of bizarre, sort of like counter revolutionary people who were clearly very, very propagandized by the imperialists and thought that they were doing God's work by fighting their own people and quote unquote saving them from their own savagery. Unfortunately, there is a significant amount of people who were involved in the Boxer Rebellion who were very much stooges of the British, of the Americans, of the Eight Nation Alliance. And yeah, I'm just trying to think of, it's just such a very complicated history. And I know Kalja on his, I think his Silk and Steel podcast, he explores this very significantly and goes into a lot more detail that I have nowhere near the same amount of knowledge. So I would highly recommend listening to that if you want like a really good crash course of like all the different factions and events, because you know there were anti-foreigner factions that were just like, nah, we just don't want foreign intervention. That was very sort of like anti-colonial. That was like, oh no, we specifically don't want Western forces. There were people who very much wanted foreign investment in China and who would sort of in this day and age be seen as sort of like wreckers. They would try to play for both sides, and it ended up with everyone sort of getting killed. But the Qing imperial government at the time, they initially weren't too supportive of the Boxer Rebellion, understandably, because it was a threat to their empire, it was a threat to their dynasty. But towards the end, because their very existence was threatened by this invasion, by the coups that would have eventually happened, they began to become more sympathetic towards the rebellion and the war that ensued. And so they would eventually provide their own soldiers, their own armies, their own sort of like resources to help in the resistance. But again, it's a very complicated history of, you've got a feudal dynasty essentially who wants to fight for its own longevity, but also and remain its sort of like control over their people, but also has to contend with these foreign invaders who want to get rid of all of it and destroy all of it. So they had to sort of toe that line. And yeah, it's just a Boxer Rebellion.
Wow, that is fascinating.
Interesting history.
And we'll be right back. We're going to continue with our conversation with Fiona, and yeah, we'll be right back.